South Africa and all its people stand on the starting line of a race that could see us take our rightful place among the winning nations of the world. Behind us, the ruins of apartheid, which denied to the great majority of our citizens the chance to realize their potential. Ahead of us, the challenge of building a new society, the rules of which give every one of us a chance to live our lives to the full. A key to a successful future is a constitution that protects the rights of every citizen and that provides the framework for good government in the new South Africa.
This is indeed a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to create a very good constitution. We are being afforded an opportunity to give power back to the people that they never used to have in the past during the apartheid regime. People like the people that one finds here, poor people in Alexandra Township. Now, it is important for us not to squander this opportunity. We must ensure that at the end of the day, we have the kind of constitution that is going to prevent the abuse of these people, ordinary people, by the state.
But perhaps we should begin by asking an obvious question. What, after all, is a constitution? A constitution is a document one of whose primary aims is to protect the citizen from the state.
Why should any citizen fear the state? Let me put it in another way. Why should any citizen fear our state? Haven't we fought for 300 years to establish a state that at last we can trust? Well, consider these 2 points. One, the state has power to do things to its citizens that were you and I to do the same things to our neighbors, we could be charged with very serious criminal offenses. For example, under certain circumstances, the state has the power to throw people into jail. If I were to do the same thing, I could be charged with anything from kidnapping to assault. Make no mistake about it, the state is a very powerful institution. That is our first point.
The second point that we wish to make is this. Constitutions are designed to protect us, not from the best of governments, but from the worst. Now, you might feel very strongly that the present government of national unity and the one that gets elected in 1999 might be worthy of your trust. But what happens afterwards when our own grandchildren vote their own government into power? You see, you have to recognize something fundamental about constitutions, and this is that constitutions are designed not to serve us for the short term, but for the long term.
The people of this country deserve a constitution that will protect them even if their worst political enemies come to power.
Only if people on the extreme left wing feel secure under an extreme right wing government, and only if people on the extreme right wing feel that their rights are secure under an extreme left wing government, can we say that we have a constitution that will protect us against the kind of massive violation of our rights that so many of us experience under apartheid.
We've been talking about how constitutions protect citizens from abuse by the state. But there's a very special role for constitutions, which is to protect the poorest and weakest members of society against the state. How do they do this? Various mechanisms have been created. Our draft constitution includes many of these checks and balances, but some important mechanisms have been overlooked.
As we've said, the people who most need protection from the state are those who were unprotected in the past, the poorest and weakest members of our society. It would be a tragedy if the very people who have sacrificed most in the struggle against apartheid find themselves most at the mercy of arbitrary government action or some other ideology in the future. Many people argue that the Constitution should help the poor overcome the disadvantages they suffered under apartheid. Why not build into the Constitution promises to give jobs to the unemployed, houses to the homeless, and free health care to everyone who needs it?
We all agree with these goals. These are truly national goals. Of course, it's important that every family should have adequate housing. In fact, it should be a goal of every society. But the proper place for these goals is in the preamble of the Constitution. Because as important as these objectives are, no country in the world can afford to build houses for every citizen. To try and do so would exhaust the economy and it would stifle growth. So it's far better to ensure that the Constitution creates the conditions necessary to generate wealth, which could then be used and channeled into housing for all.
The rights that a constitution should protect are the rights of the citizen in the face of a powerful state. The state should not, for instance, be allowed to detain us without bringing us to trial. The state should not be allowed to search our homes. It should not stop us expressing our political opinions. It should not prevent us from forming political parties, and so on.
These rights limit the power of the state. They say to the government of the day, "Thou shalt not." These are fundamental rights, but people make demands for housing, for social security, for jobs, and these are very, very controversial. And we suggest that they be put not in the Bill of Rights, but in the preamble to the Constitution.
They could, of course, be framed in an enforceable way. For instance, the government may not prevent anyone from housing themselves, or the government may not prevent anyone from seeking employment, and so on.
Alternatively, these issues could be included in an appendix to the Constitution, an appendix dedicated specifically to transitional affairs that lapses over time and does not compromise the Constitution itself.
The Constitution is a rule book that guides the actions of the state. What policies politicians adopt to realize their goals, that's up to Parliament. And every parliament will try to ensure that its citizens have basic services, better educational facilities, the chance for others to improve their qualifications, acceptable health services, and a roof over people's heads.
The primary aim of the Constitution is to protect the citizen against the state, irrespective of whatever party is in power.
But it can also protect groups against abuse. Think about this situation. A short-term religious majority in Parliament might try to act against minority religious groups. The Constitution protects minorities against political majorities. A good Constitution also protects us against powerful lobbies, groups with the money and the muscle to manipulate the political machinery of Parliament.
But there are rights that are even more fundamental than these. Property rights. One of the most burning issues in our country is the return of land to its rightful owners.
Remember that the Constitution is not a document that we will live with only for as long as it takes to wipe out the vestiges of apartheid. It will be with us for much longer than that. Clauses that we include now to redress the wrongs of the past could be used by future governments to create even more mischief and commit more injustices.
But what should a property rights clause look like? Let's imagine that at Union in 1910 the Constitution had a Bill of Rights. In fact, let's imagine that the Constitution consisted only of two guaranteed rights. One, that the state may not take anyone's property against their will, and two, that the state may not tell people what they may or may not do with their property unless it constitutes a danger to others.
If these two clauses had been our Constitution for the past 85 years, apartheid could never have happened. If the Constitution had protected our property rights, the Group Areas Act would have been illegal, the forced removals would have been unconstitutional, and bond to education would have been impossible.
There were lots of us, thousands, I was one of them, that were involved in the struggle against apartheid. One of the things that we struggled for was the restoration of private property rights. It really would be a great tragedy if the Constitution did not make a provision for the strong protection of those property rights. Then I might as well say that the struggle was in vain.
The writers of the draft Constitution have included three options in the property clause section. The first option says there should be no property rights clause. The second option says that if property is seized by the state in the public interest, then the state should pay as much compensation as it can afford. The third option also gives the state the right to seize private property. if it is in the public interest.
None of these options offers any real protection of the citizens' rights to property. Everything governments do everywhere in the world is always said by those governments or their courts to be in the public interest. However tyrannical or democratic they may be, everything the apartheid regime did was defended as being in the public interest.
What the drafters of the Property Rights Clause should imagine is that they're putting in place a constitution to protect the people from a government as intent on violating property rights as the apartheid regime and its predecessors were over 300 years. It is against such abuse that South Africans need protection now and forever. What sort of clause would be adequate protection? Well, any property rights clause should respect and protect to the maximum the rights of those whose rights have been violated in the past, those who currently hold rights, and those who will acquire rights in the future. The limitation to property rights should be narrowly phrased. Instead of allowing the state to violate our property rights in the public interest, we should make it possible for them to force private owners of land to sell only if it's for a public purpose to which there is no reasonable alternative.
Sometimes a good constitution is threatened by a little clause that limits the rights the constitution gives to citizens. Our draft constitution contains just such a limitation clause. What this limitation clause says in effect is that the government may infringe the rights of citizens if it is reasonable, necessary and justifiable. But what is reasonable, necessary and justifiable? The apartheid regime said that apartheid was reasonable, necessary and justifiable. The problem is that the rights the rest of the Constitution sets out to protect are threatened by this single clause.
The power of the state comes from the people who delegate it to their representatives in Parliament. Power comes from the bottom up, not from the top down.
I believe that decision-making should be close to the people who are actually affected by those decisions. Local decisions have to be taken at the local level. That is the very essence of participatory democracy, direct democracy. You take an issue like community policing, for example, that people feel so strongly about. That's where the community can be involved. And if it were to be involved, it would really be quite effective in containing the crime situation.
Provincial issues should be decided at the provincial level. Provinces should have real original power over all issues that are provincial in nature. Worldwide experience has shown that the cheapest and most effective government is government at the community and provincial level. Yet the draft constitution has stripped the provinces of virtually all original power, which makes them little better than the old homelands. And rather than repeat the nightmare of the homelands, we might as well abolish the provincial legislatures altogether and replace them with administrative branches of central government.
Imagine that the council representing Alexander decided that instead of spending millions on an increased police presence, they will build a new debating chamber.
Let us suppose that the Alexander residents do not go along with that decision. In terms of the current draft constitution, there is nothing that they can do about it. The only option that would be open to them would be to wait for the next election to vote out of office the local council, by which time the debating chamber will have been built and also the crime rate will have risen.
Another check on the power of government could be built into the Constitution that would give the people of Alexandria the power to force the council to spend their taxes in the way in which the community thinks right. Direct democracy, in terms of which people vote directly on issues that affect them, is the purest form of democracy. It also draws on the African tradition of consensus.
In the case we have imagined, the people of Alexandria would vote in a referendum to spend the money on policing, and the local council would be forced to follow the instructions of the people.
Constitution must ensure that the government of the day remains what it is supposed to be, and that is the servant of the people. The checks and balances that we have discussed must ensure that we not only have a good constitution for ourselves, but for our kids and forthcoming generations as well.
The race has begun. Our chance to run it as fast as we can depends on the rules of the racetrack. The rule book is our constitution, a document that protects us all, no matter how rich we are or how poor, no matter whether we live in the most crowded city or the most remote rural area. Our rainbow nation deserves the best possible constitution we can devise for it. If we get it right, then the drafters of our new constitution will be remembered as the heroic founders of a prosperous and free society.